I wonder how many of you are like me in that you read Bible stories and the literature is so good. The stories themselves are so exciting that you get caught up in the story itself, and sometimes you miss the real point of the story. Now, a classic example of that for me is a story of the encounter of Moses and Aaron with Pharaoh. This is early in Exodus. It's before the 10 plagues. And it's this awesome story where Aaron throws down his staff. It becomes a serpent. And then Pharaoh's magicians, through their magic, whatever that means, their magical arts, they make their staves become snakes, but Yahweh's snake eats their snakes. Now that's a really cool story, and there's things about it that are very difficult to explain. But for purposes of this discussion, what I want you to do is to quit thinking about the mechanics of it and think more about why the story is told and why it's here. Why is it before the 10 plagues? Now, you really cannot understand this story if you don't understand how the Egyptians thought. So go back to the 15th century BC, and one of the things that you'll find out is that long before 1500 BC, 15th century BC, going all the way back to 3100 BC, the founding of the first dynasty, even before that, Egyptian religion had pretty much been nailed down. They believed that there was a golden era in which the gods, Osiris, for example, Isis, etc., that they physically ruled the land of Egypt. And, well, they retire. Let's just leave it at that. And what happens? They set up Pharaoh to rule in their stead. And Pharaoh is considered to be a son of the gods. And he is almost like, think of this, in the biblical idea in Genesis of being made in the image of God. Pharaoh, in a sense, is the image of these gods. And he is their representative to the Egyptian people. And he is imbued with their power. Literally. He has this, on his crown, he's got a cobra and a vulture on his head. These are the goddesses of the north and the south, which were unified together in the 31st or 3100 BC with the founding of the first dynasty, the joining of the north and the south. Of course, in that story, the south won, unlike in our Civil War. And so, especially early on, Pharaoh was considered to be a god and divine, and he ruled with great power. And so, what we see over time is that he becomes known as the son of Ra. Now, what I want, for the sake of this, understanding this story, I want you to really think about that headdress, and certainly the serpent, which was a cobra, that represents powers of the gods that are coming into him. That really shows that the Egyptians worshipped snakes or held them in high regard at the very least. And this one especially was very, very powerful in their way of thinking. And so what's very interesting is that Pharaoh and his headdress are essentially the first thing that Moses and Aaron see when they come back into, when they come in to confront Pharaoh. And so, how apropos that Yahweh would have the staff turn into a serpent, the very symbol of Egyptian gods and powers. And don't forget that there is a lot going on in this story. And one thing that I would be remiss if I didn't point out is that there's a very real sense in which Pharaoh is foreshadowing the Antichrist, because he is a man who claims to be God. And what he's essentially controlled by these gods, just as the Antichrist would be effectively controlled by Satan. And so there's a sense in which Pharaoh is a type of the Antichrist and Moses is a type of Christ. And in Deuteronomy we know that Moses says and prophesies of another prophet like him, like himself. And so there is a sense in which this has immediate ramifications showing Yahweh defeating the gods of Egypt, but it also is a type looking forward in time to the struggle, if you will, between Christ and the Antichrist, which would be Revelation 19. And so this is a very, very important story. Now, one thing that's really interesting to me is that when the Pharaoh's magicians, Jannes and Jambres, if you will, they cast down their rods and they are later eaten, their snakes are, by Yahweh's snake. Think about it, it's an interesting comparison. You have one, Yahweh, it's almost like the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And there's a sense in which Yahweh is giving this Shema to the Egyptians, because you have one serpent eating the multiple. Remember, the Egyptians believed in a pantheon of gods, multiple gods. And so I don't know how many serpents were there, at least two, because it's plural, that are eaten by Yahweh's. And so there's a sense in which you see on display here the power of Yahweh. And I liken this to a heavyweight match, that Yahweh is the champion, and you have the gods of Egypt are the contenders, and he annihilates them. They don't stand a chance. And so, in this great story, archaeology and Egyptology help us to get an insight into why Moses and Aaron first come against Pharaoh, why it happens there. It sets the stage for everything, all the way through Pharaoh and his army being destroyed in the Red Sea. It sets the stage for the plagues, and ultimately with the killing of the firstborn. The killing of the firstborn represents hubris of man, the believing that their power is in that firstborn, and Yahweh kills their pride and their source of power when he kills the firstborn. And so there is a sense in which this story foreshadows the victory of Yahweh over the gods of Egypt, soon to occur in the 10 plagues, and certainly over Pharaoh and his army. It foreshadows that and the Red Sea. But also it foreshadows the ultimate victory of Christ over the Antichrist, the beast. And how apropos that he'd be called a beast when you think about, the headdress of Pharaoh with the vulture and with the cobra beast. And so read that story with a little bit more insight through archaeology. The next time you read it, think about Pharaoh and his so-called godhood or deity, being a son of Ra, etc. And with that, I bid you a fond farewell.